David Jenkins, the new state health inspector, walks into a small-town bar for a drink, only to be thrown out by the racist owner. But what will happen when the bar owner realizes the man he kicked out holds the power to shut down his business? Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The soft hum of the car's engine was the only sound accompanying David Jenkins as he drove through the winding roads toward Millbrook. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long, dappled shadows on the road ahead. David rolled down his window, letting the fresh country air fill the car. It was a peaceful drive, the kind that reminded him of his childhood visits to his grandmother's house in the countryside. Back then, the world seemed simple and full of possibility, just like today. Today marked the beginning of a new chapter in David's life, and he was determined to start it on the right foot. At 32, David had recently been appointed as a state health inspector, a role he had worked tirelessly to achieve. His journey had not been an easy one. Growing up in a working-class family, David had always known the value of hard work and perseverance. His parents had instilled in him a deep sense of responsibility and a drive to succeed, despite the obstacles he might face. Those lessons had paid off, and now here he was, on his way to his first official inspection as a health inspector. Millbrook was a small town, the kind where everyone knew each other, and news traveled fast. David had done some research before arriving. The town had a reputation for being tight-knit, with a strong sense of tradition and community. It was the kind of place where change came slowly, if at all. But that didn't worry David. He was confident in his ability to do his job fairly and professionally. He knew that health and safety regulations were important everywhere, no matter how small the town or how close its residents were. As David entered the town, he couldn't help but admire its charm. The streets were lined with well-kept houses, their front porches adorned with rocking chairs and flower pots. The town square featured a quaint fountain, and around it, small shops and businesses bustled with activity. It was the kind of place that felt like it had been frozen in time, untouched by the fast-paced world outside. David parked his car near the town's main street and decided to take a walk. He had some time before his first inspection the next morning, and he wanted to get a feel for the town. As he strolled down the street, he noticed a small bar on the corner. It had an old-fashioned wooden sign hanging above the door that read, "Carl's Tavern." The place looked like a local staple, the kind of establishment that had been around for decades, serving the same loyal customers year after year. David was in the mood for a drink, and figured this would be a good place to relax before heading back to his hotel. He approached the entrance, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilling out onto the street as he opened the door. As soon as he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The bar was dimly lit, with a handful of patrons scattered around the room. The wooden floors creaked under David's feet as he made his way toward the counter. But something wasn't right. The conversations that had filled the room just moments before had quieted. David could feel the weight of the room's gaze on him. He wasn't a stranger to such moments. As a black man in certain parts of the country, he had experienced this kind of reaction before. The subtle tension, the unspoken message that he didn't belong. Still, David chose to remain calm and composed, refusing to let their silent judgment affect him. Behind the counter stood Carl Thompson, the owner of the tavern. Carl was a burly man in his 50s, with graying hair and a grizzled face. He wiped a glass with a rag, eyeing David as he approached. Carl's expression was cold, and there was something in his eyes that made David pause. "Can I get a drink?" David asked, trying to break the tension. Carl didn't answer right away. He placed the glass down on the counter, leaning forward slightly. His voice was low and gruff when he finally spoke. "I think you're in the wrong place, friend." David blinked, unsure of what Carl meant. "I'm just here for a drink, that's all." Carl's eyes narrowed. "I don't think so. We don't serve your kind here." David felt a sharp sting in his chest. He had hoped that this kind of thing wouldn't happen today, not on his first day in town, not when he was feeling so optimistic about his new job. But here it was, laid bare in front of him. The ugly truth of prejudice, plain and simple. "I just want a drink," David repeated, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't going to let Carl push him out so easily. Carl straightened up, crossing his arms over his chest. I don't care what you want. You need to leave. The bar's patrons who had been watching the exchange remained silent. No one spoke up. No one intervened. They just watched, their expressions ranging from discomfort to indifference. David glanced around, searching for some sign of support, but there was none. He was alone in this. David felt his jaw tighten, but he knew better than to escalate the situation. He had faced racism before, and he knew how quickly things could spiral out of control if he wasn't careful. He also knew that no matter how unfairly he was being treated, he had to remain professional. After all, he had a job to do, and tomorrow he would be back, but in a very different capacity. Without another word, David turned and walked out of the bar. As he stepped back onto the street, the cool evening air hit his face, a stark contrast to the heated exchange inside. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. He couldn't let this get to him. Not now. Not when he had worked so hard to get to this point in his career. As David walked back to his car, he reminded himself of why he was here. His role as a health inspector was to ensure that establishments like Carl's Tavern were safe and up to code. Tomorrow, he would inspect the tavern with the same professionalism and attention to detail that he brought to every task. Carl's behavior wouldn't change that. But deep down, David knew that tomorrow's inspection would be different. It wasn't just about health codes and safety standards anymore. It was about standing up for himself, for what was right, and for the countless others who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. Tomorrow, Carl would see David in a new light, and the consequences of his actions would soon follow. As David drove away from the town square, he couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. He knew that the events of today were only the beginning of something much larger, something that would unfold in ways neither he nor Carl could yet imagine. And so, with the sun setting behind him and the road stretching out ahead, David prepared for what was to come. Tomorrow, the real story would begin. The following morning, the sun had barely begun to rise when David found himself awake, preparing for his first day of inspections. His thoughts lingered on the previous day's encounter at Carl's Tavern, but he forced himself to push those feelings aside. His job as a state health inspector required impartiality, professionalism, and a clear head. Whatever personal frustrations he might have felt about how he was treated, they could not interfere with his work. David went through his morning routine methodically, focusing on the details. His shirt neatly pressed, badge polished, clipboard organized with all the necessary forms. Today wasn't just any inspection day. It was the day he would inspect Carl's Tavern. David knew this inspection would be different, not because of personal revenge, but because of the responsibility he held to do the right thing. The incident had given him a sharper lens through which to view the bar. While he would remain professional, he knew he would be more alert to any issues that might arise. Carl's treatment of him as a person had already been questionable. What might his attitude be toward health standards? As David arrived at the Millbrook Health Department office to gather the final materials for his day, he couldn't help but feel a pang of unease about returning to the tavern. Yet he reminded himself that this was exactly why he had been appointed to this position, to ensure that all businesses met the same high standards, regardless of the owner's personal beliefs or attitudes. It wasn't just about enforcing regulations, it was about ensuring fairness and safety for everyone. Millbrook had a small health department, which suited the town's size. It was clear that the community wasn't accustomed to rigorous inspections, and many of the local businesses operated as they always had, with minimal oversight. David's appointment marked a new era of more consistent regulation, something that made some of the locals uncomfortable. But he was determined to set a high standard for professionalism, fairness, and justice. David reviewed the day's itinerary, which included inspections of several local restaurants, grocery stores, and of course, Carl's Tavern. He mentally prepared himself for each one, knowing that the tavern was likely to be the most challenging stop on his route. By mid-morning, David was in his car, heading toward his first inspection. The earlier businesses had gone smoothly, with no major infractions to report, though a few places needed minor improvements. His professionalism was never in question, and he treated every business owner with respect, no matter who they were or how they acted. Now it was time to return to Carl's tavern. David parked his car near the same spot he had the day before. He sat for a moment, staring at the tavern's wooden sign. The memories of being told to leave still weighed on him, but today, the dynamics would be different. Today, he wasn't just a customer. He was the authority. Taking a deep breath, David grabbed his clipboard, checked his badge, and headed toward the entrance. As soon as he stepped inside, the mood shifted once again. The tavern was quiet, with only a few early customers sitting at the bar. Carl, standing behind the counter, froze when he saw David. The recognition in Carl's eyes was instant, and his expression quickly morphed from indifference to unease. "Morning," David said, his voice calm and professional as he approached the bar. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his official badge, flashing it in Carl's direction. "I'm David Jenkins, State Health Inspector. I'm here for a scheduled inspection of your establishment." Carl's face went pale. The silence in the room was thick, and the few patrons sitting at the bar exchanged awkward glances. Carl stood there for a moment, as if trying to process what was happening. His hands clenched the rag he had been using to clean a glass, but he said nothing. "Shall we get started?" David asked, determined to move forward despite Carl's obvious discomfort. Finally, Carl nodded stiffly and stepped aside, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Right this way," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. David followed Carl through the bar, making his way into the back area where the kitchen was located. As they walked, Carl's stiff posture told David everything he needed to know. The owner had no idea who David was yesterday, and now the gravity of his mistake was sinking in. The small-town arrogance that Carl had displayed the day before had crumbled in the face of the reality that the man he had humiliated held significant power over the future of his business. The kitchen was a stark contrast to the well-maintained front of the bar. It was cluttered, with dirty dishes piled up in the sink, and the smell of grease hung in the air. David's sharp eyes immediately began scanning for signs of infractions, not out of any personal vendetta, but because his job was to ensure the safety of the patrons who ate here. And from what he could see, the tavern's kitchen had more than a few issues. David moved systematically through the kitchen, inspecting the food storage areas first. His trained eye quickly picked up on several violations. The fridge, meant to store perishable items at a safe temperature, was operating several degrees too warm. Inside, David found food that had clearly been sitting for too long, some of it past its expiration date. "I'm going to need to make a note of this," David said, jotting down the violation on his clipboard. Carl, who had been hovering nearby, looked as though he wanted to say something but held back. Next, David turned his attention to the cleanliness of the kitchen. The floors were sticky, the countertops cluttered with unwashed utensils, and the ventilation system was coated in a thick layer of grease. David had seen kitchens in worse condition, but this one was certainly not up to the standard it should be. As David continued his inspection, Carl grew increasingly agitated. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, and his face was flushed with frustration. David could feel the tension rising in the room, but he remained focused on the task at hand. After all, he wasn't here for personal reasons. He was here to do his job. When David moved toward the storage pantry, he found another issue. Several boxes of food had been improperly stored, with raw meat stacked on top of vegetables, creating a potential cross-contamination hazard. "That's another violation," David said, marking it down. Carl finally spoke up, his voice filled with defensiveness. "Look, I've been running this place for years, never had any complaints before. Why are you suddenly nitpicking every little thing?" David turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. "These aren't small things, Carl. These are serious health violations. If these issues aren't addressed, they can cause real harm to your customers." Carl's frustration seemed to reach a boiling point. He opened his mouth to argue, but then he stopped. It was clear he wanted to push back, to defend himself and his bar, but he also knew he was cornered. There was no getting around the fact that his tavern wasn't up to code. David finished his inspection, noting all the violations on his report. He explained to Carl what needed to be fixed and gave him a timeline for addressing the issues. Carl, still simmering with anger and embarrassment, nodded begrudgingly, knowing there was little he could do but comply. As David left the tavern, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He hadn't set out to punish Carl, but justice had been served, and Carl's actions the day before had indirectly brought these issues to light. David had done his job, and now it was up to Carl to decide how he would respond. As David walked back to his car, he glanced back at the tavern, wondering if Carl had learned anything from their interactions, not just about health codes, but about respect and decency. Time would tell, but for now, David had done what was required of him. The early morning light filtered through the windows of Carl's tavern as Carl Thompson sat behind the counter, staring blankly at the health inspection report David had handed him. His mind was racing, replaying every moment from the previous day. The list of violations felt like a series of blows that he hadn't seen coming, each one hitting him harder than the last. He could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. The tavern had been his life for over 2 decades, passed down to him by his father, and its success had always been a point of pride for him. He had weathered the ups and downs of the business, and, while it wasn't the most modern or pristine place, it had always kept its loyal customers coming back. Carl had built the bar into what it was, a local institution in Millbrook. Yet now, it seemed everything he'd worked for was at risk because of a single encounter with David Jenkins. Carl's chest tightened as he remembered the way he had treated David the day before. His gut churned with regret, but not just because of the looming consequences. He had acted out of impulse, relying on the same prejudices that had quietly shaped much of his life. But now, looking at the list of health violations, he knew he had crossed a line that went beyond personal disdain. He had not only risked his livelihood but also the safety and health of his patrons. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, crumpling the report slightly in frustration. The bar was a mess, figuratively and literally, and he had only himself to blame. As Carl sat stewing in his thoughts, the tavern's door creaked open and his longtime bartender Jerry walked in. Jerry was an older man who had worked for Carl for over 15 years, and he could sense immediately that something was off. "You all right, boss?" Jerry asked, eyeing Carl with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Carl shook his head slowly, his eyes still glued to the report. "Health inspector came in yesterday. We're in trouble, Jerry." Jerry raised an eyebrow and approached the counter, taking the report from Carl's hands. He scanned the list of violations and let out a low whistle. "This doesn't look good, Carl. How did it get this bad?" Carl ran a hand through his graying hair, his frustration simmering. "I don't know. I guess I let things slide. The place ain't what it used to be, and I didn't want to spend the money on upgrades. And now it's come back to bite me." Jerry nodded, understanding the weight of Carl's situation. "So who was the inspector? Anyone we know?" Carl hesitated for a moment, his expression hardening. "It was that guy from yesterday, the one I threw out." Jerry blinked in surprise. "You mean, the man you wouldn't serve?" Carl nodded, his face reddening with embarrassment. "I didn't know who he was. He came in for a drink and I let my own damn stupidity get in the way. Kicked him out without thinking twice, and now he's the health inspector." Jerry didn't say anything for a moment, but the look on his face said it all. Carl had made a grave error, and he knew it. That's not good, Carl. Not good at all." "No kidding," Carl grumbled, rubbing his temples. "Now I've got a mountain of fines to pay, and I've got to fix all these issues, or I could lose the tavern, and it's all because I let my temper and my damn attitude get in the way." Jerry leaned on the counter, his tone softer. "Look, Carl, I've known you for a long time, and I know you're not a bad man, but maybe this is a wake-up call. You can't keep running this place like it's still the 80s. Things have changed, and you've got to change with them, in more ways than one." Carl stared at Jerry for a long time, his pride warring with the truth in his words. He didn't like being told he was wrong, but deep down, he knew Jerry was right. Things had changed, and his refusal to adapt had led him to this breaking point. After a long silence, Carl finally sighed. "You're right. I've been stubborn for too long. It's time I fix this place up. and maybe fix myself along the way. Jerry gave him a reassuring nod. Good. Now let's figure out how to start tackling that list. We've got a lot of work to do. While Carl and Jerry got to work on cleaning up the tavern and addressing the immediate health violations, the news of the inspection spread quickly through Millbrook. In a town as small as theirs, it didn't take long for rumors to circulate. Some locals whispered about the violations, while others discussed Carl's encounter with David. The story had taken on a life of its own, and soon enough, people began to avoid the tavern altogether, fearing it was unsafe or that they might get caught up in the drama surrounding the inspection. Carl had never cared much for gossip, but this was different. The livelihoods of his staff were also on the line. With fewer customers coming in, his income had taken a sharp dive, and the mounting costs of repairs and upgrades to meet health standards were adding up quickly. As he scrubbed down the bar's kitchen counters, Carl couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that had been gnawing at him since the inspection. Every corner he turned, every surface he wiped, seemed to reveal yet another problem he hadn't noticed before. Expired products, malfunctioning equipment, and improper food storage had become commonplace in his establishment, and he had been too blind to see it. He hated to admit it, but David had done his job well, and the more Carl thought about it, the more he realized how much he had been coasting on the tavern's reputation, rather than maintaining the quality and standards that had once made it a local favorite. He had become complacent, and it had nearly cost him everything. But beyond the physical violations, there was something else gnawing at Carl, something far deeper. His actions toward David were shameful, and as much as he tried to brush it off as just another confrontation, he knew that wasn't true. David had been nothing but polite, and yet Carl had treated him with disdain and disrespect for no other reason than the color of his skin. This wasn't just about the tavern's health violations, it was about his own personal failures. After a long day of scrubbing, repairing, and organizing, Carl sat alone in the tavern, the lights dimmed and the chairs stacked on the tables. He had sent Jerry home earlier, wanting some time to think. As he sat in the quiet, Carl's thoughts drifted back to his father, the man who had originally opened Carl's tavern. His father had been a hard man, set in his ways, and as much as Carl had loved him, he couldn't deny that his father's worldview had shaped much of his own. Growing up, Carl had learned to see the world through a narrow lens, and that had stayed with him well into adulthood. But now, as he stared at the empty bar, Carl wondered if his father had been wrong. If he had been wrong. He had prided himself on upholding the old ways, on keeping things the way they had always been. But maybe that wasn't something to be proud of anymore. Maybe it was time to let go of those old beliefs, to make room for something better. The thought of apologizing to David crossed Carl's mind, but he quickly pushed it aside. Apologies were never his strong suit, and he wasn't sure he had the courage to admit how wrong he had been. But as much as he tried to avoid the thought, it kept returning, gnawing at him like a splinter in his conscience. Carl sighed and leaned back in his chair, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The tavern, his pride, his past, it all felt like too much to carry. But for the first time in a long time, Carl felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew that things couldn't stay the same. And so, as the night stretched on and the tavern sat in stillness, Carl made a quiet decision. He would fix what was broken, not just in the tavern, but in himself. He didn't know how long it would take or if he even knew where to start, but he knew he had to try. The next day, Carl would begin making calls to contractors and suppliers, getting the tavern in shape. But beyond that, he would need to confront the man he had wronged, David Jenkins. How he would do it, he didn't know, but it was a step he couldn't avoid any longer. The real work was just beginning. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Carl's tavern, casting long shadows across the empty tables. It had been several days since the health inspection, and the normally lively bar was eerily quiet. Carl Thompson stood behind the counter, staring at the phone in his hand. He had made the necessary calls to contractors and suppliers, as he had promised himself, but the repairs would take time, and the costs were mounting. What hurt even more was the absence of his regular customers. Carl had taken pride in the fact that his tavern was a staple in Millbrook, a place where locals gathered after a long day's work. But now, the tables sat empty. Word had spread fast about the health violations, and even faster about his confrontation with David Jenkins. People talked in small towns, and Carl's actions had become the talk of Millbrook. Everywhere Carl went, he felt the weight of their judgment. His reputation, once solid as a rock, was now fragile and fraying at the edges. The locals weren't just avoiding his bar because of the health violations, they were avoiding him. And Carl couldn't deny the truth. His own arrogance and narrow-mindedness had brought him to this point. He could hear Jerry moving around in the back, cleaning up after the previous night's slow shift. Carl's longtime bartender had been a steady presence through all of this, but even Jerry couldn't lift the heavy cloud of despair that hung over the tavern. Carl took a deep breath, pushing the phone away. He knew that even if he fixed every physical violation in the bar, there was a deeper problem he needed to address. And that problem wasn't something a contractor could repair. As Carl wiped down the bar, his mind drifted back to his childhood, to the lessons his father had taught him. His father had always been a hard man, with rigid beliefs and an old-fashioned view of the world. Carl had inherited those views without question, and for most of his life, he had lived by them. But now, standing in the empty tavern that was once a symbol of his success, Carl realized that those beliefs had led him down a dangerous path. He thought about David Jenkins. The way he had treated him that day, the casual dismissal, the prejudice. It hadn't been the first time Carl had turned someone away because they didn't fit the image he had of who belonged in his bar. But this time, it had backfired spectacularly. Carl didn't want to admit it, but he knew he owed David an apology. He had wronged him, not just as a customer, but as a human being. The thought of facing David again filled Carl with anxiety. But deep down, he knew it was the right thing to do. He couldn't fix the tavern until he faced the truth about himself and the damage he had caused. The thought gnawed at him for days. Every time he passed by the inspection report on his desk, the list of violations seemed to glare back at him, reminding him that this was his doing. He had allowed the tavern to fall into disrepair, just as he had allowed his own values and sense of decency to deteriorate. Finally, one afternoon, Carl made a decision. He would go to David's office and apologize. He didn't know how the conversation would go, or if David would even listen, but it was something he had to do. If he had any hope of rebuilding his life and his business, it had to start with acknowledging his mistakes. The next day, Carl found himself standing outside the Millbrook Health Department building. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the glass doors, wondering if he had the strength to go through with it. His mind raced with doubts. Would David even want to see him? Would he laugh in his face, dismiss him the way Carl had dismissed him at the bar? He wouldn't blame him if he did. But Carl had made up his mind. He took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and walked inside. The receptionist at the front desk looked up and smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Carl cleared his throat, feeling a lump form. "I'm here to see David Jenkins." The receptionist nodded and picked up the phone, calling David's office. Carl stood there, his heart racing, as he waited for her to finish the call. After a few moments, she hung up the phone and looked back at Carl. "Mr. Jenkins will see you now. His office is down the hall, third door on the right." Carl nodded and thanked her, his feet feeling like lead as he made his way down the hall. When he reached David's office, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door handle. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he had to say something. Finally, he knocked. "Come in," came David's voice from the other side of the door. Carl pushed the door open and stepped inside. David was sitting at his desk, paperwork spread out in front of him. When he looked up and saw Carl, his expression was unreadable. There was no anger, no surprise, just calm professionalism, the same way David had conducted himself during the inspection. "Carl," David said evenly, leaning back in his chair. "What can I do for you?" Carl swallowed hard, suddenly feeling very small in front of the man he had wronged. I wanted to talk to you," Carl began, his voice shaky. "I know you probably don't want to hear it, but I owe you an apology." David raised an eyebrow but remained silent, waiting for Carl to continue. Carl took a deep breath. I acted like a real jerk that day. The way I treated you, it wasn't right. I let my own stupid biases get in the way, and I'm sorry for that. I shouldn't have thrown you out of the bar like that. You didn't deserve it. David nodded slowly, his expression still calm. You're right, I didn't. Carl felt a pang of guilt at David's words. He had expected anger, maybe even a lecture, but David's composure only made Carl feel worse. He had wronged this man, and yet David wasn't rubbing it in his face. He was simply acknowledging the truth. I've been doing a lot of thinking since the inspection, Carl continued, and I realize now that I've let a lot of things slide, not just in the bar but in myself. I've been holding on to things that don't matter, things that are wrong, and I want to make it right, starting with you. David looked at Carl for a long moment before speaking. I appreciate the apology, Carl. It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong, but an apology is just the first step. The real work comes after. Carl nodded, feeling the weight of David's words. I know I've got a lot of work to do, on the bar and on myself, but I wanted to start by saying I'm sorry. David leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. Apology accepted, Carl, but like I said, actions speak louder than words. It's up to you to follow through. Carl felt a wave of relief wash over him. He hadn't expected forgiveness, but David had given him a chance to make things right. It wasn't an easy road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Carl felt like he was on the right path. Thank you, Carl said, his voice thick with emotion. I won't let you down. David nodded, offering Carl a small but sincere smile. I hope you don't. Carl left the health department feeling lighter than he had in days. The conversation with David had been difficult, but it was the first step toward healing, not just for Carl, but for the bar and for the relationships he had damaged. Over the next few weeks, Carl threw himself into fixing the tavern. He hired contractors to update the kitchen, replaced old equipment, and ensured that every health code violation was addressed. It wasn't cheap, and Carl had to dip into his savings to cover the costs, but he knew it was necessary. More than that, it was the right thing to do. But Carl's transformation didn't stop at the tavern. He also began to reflect on his own beliefs, questioning the values he had held on to for so long. He started attending town meetings and engaging with people he had previously ignored or dismissed. Slowly, he began to open his mind to new perspectives, realizing that his way of thinking had been holding him back in more ways than one. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Carl felt like giving up. But every time he thought about the conversation with David, he remembered that the real work had just begun, and he was committed to seeing it through. As the tavern reopened after the renovations, Carl noticed something remarkable. Some of his old customers returned, but new faces also began to appear. People he had never seen in the bar before. They were curious and maybe even a little cautious, but they came. And as Carl stood behind the counter watching the tavern fill up with life once again, he realized that this wasn't just about fixing a business. It was about fixing himself and the way he interacted with the world around him. Carl's tavern had been given a second chance, and so had Carl. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to make the most of it. The days stretched into weeks as Carl Thompson worked to repair not just his tavern, but also the pieces of his life that had crumbled under the weight of his own choices. Millbrook, a town steeped in tradition, had been slow to accept change. But slowly, Carl was learning that he had to be the change he wanted to see, both in his business and within himself. The renovations in the tavern had transformed the place. The kitchen now gleamed with new appliances, and the bar's interior had been cleaned and refreshed. The health violations that once threatened to shut down his livelihood were now a thing of the past. Every morning, Carl would walk through the kitchen, making sure everything was in perfect order. Every evening, before closing, he would do the same. There was no more room for complacency, no more cutting corners. This was his chance to start fresh. But fixing the tavern was only part of the journey. Carl knew the deeper challenge was fixing his own reputation, both in Millbrook and in his own eyes. The slow road to trust. The first few days after the tavern reopened were tough. People still hesitated to return, and the once bustling tables remained mostly empty. The townspeople had heard about the violations, but even more damaging were the whispers about Carl's treatment of David Jenkins. People were talking, and Carl's reputation had taken a hit. Carl wasn't surprised. He had been expecting this. In fact, he welcomed it. He had lived long enough believing that his narrow-minded views and behavior had no consequences. Now he knew better, and the town's slow response to his reopening was a reflection of that lesson. Still, there were moments when the empty bar got to him. He would stand behind the counter, wiping down the already spotless surface, wondering if the town would ever forgive him. The idea of sitting alone in a tavern he had built with his own hands, now abandoned by the very community that once embraced it, was almost too much to bear. But just when Carl thought the silence of the tavern would drive him mad, he began to notice small changes. It started with a few regulars, men who had known him for years. They trickled back in, one by one, each one curious to see the changes he had made. At first, their conversations were cautious, as if they weren't sure what to expect. But as they looked around and saw the improvements, both in the tavern and in Carl's demeanor, they began to open up again. "Place looks good, Carl," one of the regulars, Tom, said as he leaned on the counter one evening. "Heard you've been making some changes, not just to the place, but to yourself." Carl chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, I've had to do some thinking. Realized I wasn't living right. I hurt some people. Tried to run the place the way my dad did, but the world's changed. I needed to change too." Tom nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip of his beer. It takes a big man to admit when he's wrong, and an even bigger one to do something about it. Carl felt a warmth he hadn't expected. For so long, he had been living in the shadow of his father's legacy, trying to hold on to an outdated worldview that no longer fit the present. Now, with every word of encouragement from his regulars, he felt like he was stepping out from under that shadow, finally finding his own way. A community returns. Over time, more people began to return to the tavern. At first, it was just the regulars, the men who had always come for a beer after work or a meal with their families on the weekends. But then, something unexpected happened. New faces began to appear. One evening, a young couple walked into the bar, people Carl had never seen before. They sat quietly at a table near the window, ordered drinks, and observed the place with interest. Carl watched them from behind the counter, curious but cautious. He had never been good with new customers, always assuming they would stick around if they wanted to. But this time was different. Carl felt a need to connect with these people, to show them that his bar was a welcoming place for everyone, regardless of who they were. Gathering his courage, Carl approached their table. "Evening," he said with a small smile. "How's everything? You liking the place?" The man looked up, surprised at Carl's friendliness, and nodded. "Yeah, it's nice. We just moved to Millbrook a couple of weeks ago. Heard this was a local spot." Carl's heart raced. He wasn't used to conversations like this, talking to people who didn't know him, who didn't have any preconceived notions about who he was. "Glad you came by," Carl said. "If you need anything, let me know. We've got a new kitchen set up, so if you're hungry, the food's better than ever." The couple smiled, and for the first time in a long time, Carl felt a genuine connection with his customers, not as regulars or people who owed him loyalty, but as fellow human beings. It felt good. It felt right. From that moment on, things slowly began to improve. The tavern was no longer just a place for the old regulars. It was becoming a space for new faces, new conversations, and new opportunities. Carl began to see families come in, younger people who had moved to Millbrook, looking for a sense of community. It was as if the tavern, once stuck in the past, was now becoming part of the town's future. Despite the positive changes in his tavern and the community's slow but steady return, there was one thing Carl couldn't shake: his encounter with David Jenkins. Carl had apologized to David, but he knew that words were only the first step. He needed to show David and himself that he was serious about making things right. One afternoon, after the lunch rush had passed and the tavern was quiet, Carl found himself thinking about David again. He had seen him around town a few times, always busy with his inspections or chatting with other locals. But Carl hadn't approached him since their meeting in the health department office. The weight of that unfinished business sat heavily on Carl's shoulders. After a few moments of internal debate, Carl made a decision. He grabbed his jacket, told Jerry he'd be back later, and left the tavern. David's office wasn't far, and Carl found himself standing outside the door once again. This time, he wasn't there for an apology. He was there for something more. He knocked, and after a moment, David opened the door. He seemed surprised to see Carl but gestured for him to come in. "Carl," David said, his tone neutral. "What brings you here?" Carl took a deep breath. "I just wanted to talk. I know I already apologized, but I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I wanted to make sure I'm doing right by you. I've made changes to the tavern, to myself, but I wanted to check in with you." David studied Carl for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he nodded. "You've been making an effort, Carl. I've seen it. People talk in this town, and I've heard about the changes you've made. That's good." Carl felt a flicker of hope. "I want to do more than just fix the bar. I want to fix the way I've been living. I know it's not an overnight thing, and I've still got a lot to learn, but I want to be better." David leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Change isn't easy, Carl. It's not something you can just decide to do one day and be done with. It takes time and it takes consistency, but from what I've seen, you're heading in the right direction." Carl felt a wave of relief wash over him. He hadn't expected David to be so gracious, but then again, that was the kind of man David was. "I appreciate that," Carl said quietly, "and I'm going to keep working at it." David nodded. "That's all anyone can ask for." Carl stood up to leave, but before he did, he turned to David one last time. "If you ever want to come by the tavern," Carl said, "I'd like to buy you a drink, on the house." David smiled, a small but genuine expression. "I'll think about it, Carl. Maybe one day." With that, Carl left the office, feeling lighter than he had in months. He wasn't fully redeemed yet, that much he knew. But he was on the path, and for the first time, it felt like the right one. Carl returned to his tavern that afternoon, the sun casting a warm glow through the windows as the evening crowd began to filter in. For the first time in a long while, Carl felt a deep sense of peace. The tavern was full again, and more importantly, it was full of people who felt welcome, regardless of who they were or where they came from. As Carl stood behind the bar, serving drinks and chatting with customers, he realized that the tavern was no longer just a place for him to live out his father's legacy. It was now something more. It was a place where the past met the future, where mistakes could be corrected, and where people, including Carl, could find a way forward. The road to redemption was long, but Carl was walking it, one step at a time. And for the first time in his life, he knew he was heading in the right direction. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.